Hello and welcome to Newsclick. Today we have with us Professor Jayati Ghosh from Jawaharlal Nehru University, Department of Economics, to discuss the sliding of the rupee. Rupee seems to have come to its lowest point for quite some time. Is it something which is systemic in the Indian economy at the moment, that the external account deficits are really rising and therefore this is what is happening, or is it something which is temporary because of certain FII decisions to withdraw some money and so on?
No, I think the FII decisions to withdraw are part of a recognition of a wider weakness, and this has been evident for some time. It had to come. It's coming now perhaps because of the fact that globally also there is more uncertainty and there is a slight shift back to the United States. But clearly India, even among the emerging markets and among the other BRICS, is seen as possibly the weakest economy at the moment.
So therefore you think this is part of a longer difficulty of the Indian economy? It's
a medium-term problem, and it's a problem that has been building up for some time. We have a very, very large current account deficit, and we have an extremely enormous trade deficit which has been rising rapidly in the last 2 years. Some of this could have been contained. For example, a large part of it is gold imports, for which really there's no justification. So the government should have acted a lot earlier to stem the gold imports. Some of it is because of the price of oil. That's what the government keeps saying. But it's really because we have also mismanaged the oil economy to a significant extent, as you know. So a large part of it is the fact that all the years of domestic mismanagement, which have been reflecting in the external account, are coming home to roost.
So this is a structural problem of the Indian economy that is displaying itself in terms of an external account deficit at the moment.
You see, we have been running very large deficits. The difference is that in the last 2 years, these deficits are growing and they are more and more reliant on very short-term inflows, which we know are notoriously volatile. And we also know, this is a pattern that many countries have gone through, that when those deficits reach a certain point, then international capital and your own domestic capital all get nervous and decide to keep away.
Now, there are two parts to the current account deficit. One is the fact that you are importing large amounts and there is a huge trade deficit that is there. And secondly, of course, that you have been inviting in really FIIs on a very large, in a very large way, and that actually also inflates your imports. Fact is, they are looking for certain kinds of goods, setting up certain kinds of industry. A lot of it is just hot money.
The FIIs don't necessarily directly inflate the imports. What happens is we have three kinds of capital inflow. One is we have the FDI, so-called, the direct investment. A lot of that, as you say, is much more import intensive, and it also leads to outflows on the current account, which are things like the repatriation of profits, the royalties that you pay, the technical fees, the consultants that they hire from abroad. So they typically they use much more foreign exchange. There is another kind of FDI that we've got a lot of recently, which is private equity. Now, private equity is not in there for the long term. They come to basically buy up distressed assets, restructure them and sell them off at a profit. So they are inherently short term in nature. We've had a lot of that in the last 5 or 6 years. A lot of that would be leaving. And of course, when they repatriate, they're taking capital gains, and in between they're taking dividends. Then there is external commercial borrowing. We have absolutely encouraged domestic companies to go in for larger borrowing from abroad because the interest rates are much lower. And while India was favored and as a desired destination, many of these companies were able to access cheaper loans. They have taken on loans often for global expansion. We are actually, in fact, it's quite ridiculous that there is a lot of borrowing by Indian companies not for domestic investment, but even for external investment. Some of it from our public sector banks, some of it from external borrowing. But it ends up showing in our external accounts. Now, in addition to that, we have a significant increase, not just in the trade deficit, but we are losing in some areas that used to be what we assumed we could just keep raking it in forever. For example, remittances. Remittances have saved the balance of payments for the last 3 decades. But the rate at which they're able to save is coming down. In other words, they're not increasing as fast as they were.
As our imports are increasing.
Exactly, and our trade deficit is increasing. So remittances are becoming a weaker source of strength. They're still a source of strength, but the rate of increase is less.
Contribution to the total amount is not as high as it was.
Some of our invisibles, we go on about software exports. The software surplus is falling. We are importing a lot more software than we were in the past. Even in these areas of supposed strength, we're not as strong as we used to be. And then, of course, the global environment is such that our exports are flat or falling, but our imports, what's happened last year, if you look at the last financial year, our exports fell, imports fell at a slightly lower rate, okay, and so the gap grew. So
gap actually widened.
The gap widened. And so we have this ballooning trade deficit, and we have these invisible payments which are less able to meet that trade deficit. So the current account is now 5.7% of GDP, nearly 6%, a ridiculously high amount.
Jayati, there are two strategies that the government seems to be following. One is to invite more short-term money in, more hot money in, making it even more attractive to foreign capital. The other seems to be cutting down on essentially internal, what shall we say, what it calls the subsidies to the poor. That seems to be its direction in trying to look at its control its deficit. What do you think is the government's response to the existing crisis that we are seeing?
In fact, both of those things that you mentioned are part of the same idea. It is that you have to attract foreign capital come what may, because that's the only way you can finance the deficit. So you're not thinking about closing the deficit. You're not thinking about how can we reduce this deficit in a way that will direct more expenditure domestically. You're saying, oh, we have this huge deficit, only foreign capital can save us. What can we do to somehow bring them in? And of course, one of the things you have to do, supposedly, to attract foreign capital is to cut down on your fiscal deficit, which means you have to cut down on every form of spending that is seen as populist. In other words, that will affect the people and the poor. You have to actually, it doesn't mean that you're not going to keep providing subsidies to large corporates. There is still an attempt to do a gas pricing system that it would hand over a huge amount of money just to one company, for example. And that would go from the public exchequer. Nobody talks about the subsidy, nobody talks about the fiscal deficit when you're talking about that kind of thing. But when it comes to essential spending, when it comes to spending that would meet the social and economic rights of the people, suddenly that we can't afford anymore.
So you can afford subsidy for a money, but you cannot give subsidy to give food to the Indian people.
That's one part of it. And the other is that then you have to make life easier for the foreign capital that comes in, because somehow you have to attract them. How do you make life easier? You reduce the regulations on them when they're here. You reduce any constraint on them taking the money out, because they're only going to come in if they know they can take it out easily. And you reduce all kinds of things like tax structures. You bring down the tax elements, you bring down things like capital gains tax, you provide more areas in which they can invest. This is very clearly what the Manmohan Singh cabinet is planning to do in the near future. A range of things that would liberalize financial institutions, get rid of caps on FDI, even the sectoral caps, in this effort to attract hot money of all kinds.
And also remove whatever taxation measures existed, which they were anyway flouting, the Vodafone case being
absolutely.
a classic
and basically,
example.
There's no question of even differential taxation. Even the level playing field in taxes is not to be allowed.
What are the other options the government has which it is not taking?
There are any number of measures that could very easily be taken. The first is to cut down on non-essential imports, and the most significant of these is, of course, gold. We are once again the sink of precious metals that Keynes described the Indian economy as. And there's really no reason for this. It is supposedly going in for re-export, but we know that that's not the case, because there's a very significant trade deficit in gold that we have at the moment. We should massively increase the import duty on gold and prevent this kind of unnecessary import that would already bring down the trade deficit by at least $20–30 billion, because we have this massive import in the last year. There is a whole range of others where we can institute a variable tariff. We are still within our tariff bindings for a whole range of imported commodities. So we could institute variable tariffs on a range of finished goods which again are non-essential, which are luxury, Italian marble for housing, or it's all of that kind of thing. We could easily prevent that kind of non-essential imports. We must reduce our reliance on short-term capital. So there's absolutely no reason to keep having large deficits and saying that the only way we can get out of it is to have more and more short-term capital.
And more deficit.
And more deficit. That's fundamentally flawed, because that short-term capital also leads to current account outflows, not just trade account, but current account outflows as well. So it's doubly expensive. It can leave very quickly, but even while it's there, they will be repatriating dividends and profits and things like that.
And even in the oil economy, for instance, we could look at public sector transport much more,
Absolutely.
cut down on private transport, make private transport much more expensive, instead of making cars much more subsidized, if you will.
In the medium term, there is a huge range of measures that we could take. I mean, in terms of actually thinking in a green economy way, which we really haven't. In fact, our planning has been remarkably bereft of any ecological or environmental considerations. We are not planning for the future in terms of conserving energy, we're not planning for the future in terms of urbanization, and we're not planning for the future in terms of our external account, about how to make the Indian economy less vulnerable, less fragile to global capital flows.
Which is in fact not only an issue of current account deficit, but also issue of energy self-sufficiency, if you will.
Absolutely. And you know, ultimately these are of course things that will affect the economy, and when you have a crisis we will know how deeply that affects every person, even those who have not benefited from the boom. But these are also issues of a strategic significance. You know, you can't be dependent on energy, on food and on so many basic essentials and still retain autonomy, still hope to be a great power, entering the world stage and doing all that kind of thing.
Jayati, one last word. Do you think Indian economy is really going to go down very significantly this year, of the kind of crisis we have seen in Greece, Europe and other places?
Let me put it this way. The Indian economy today shows classic pre-crisis symptoms that have been experienced in many other countries. In the Southeast Asian countries in '97, in Turkey in 2000, in Argentina, in a number of countries. So certainly we have all the symptoms. When exactly this crisis breaks, how it breaks and what the impact is, obviously they're going to differ. But there's no doubt we have got every single one of the symptoms of a crisis.
So the crystal ball would indicate the good chance of a short-term crisis emerging in the Indian economy.
You know, when that happens, the reasons will be economic, but it is going to be ascribed to politics. It's going to be ascribed to a fear of a hung parliament or political instability or not having reformers in place and all kinds of things like that. The real reasons are economic, and they are directly the result of the economic strategy of this government.
Structural factors, which are systemic factors, which this government has followed and even the earlier NDA government had followed.
Well, yes. The earlier NDA government began it, but it has really been accelerated
by the
in UPA 2. Yes.
Thank you very much. We'll come back to you again as you observe what's happening to the rupee and the Indian economy.
I wish I could say it's a pleasure to talk about it, but it's also depressing.